I once heard it said that stories are the air we breathe. They surround us. They seep into our blood and bones. They comfort us, frighten us, inspire us, define us. So who do we become as a people when our most sacred stories are silenced, siloed, distorted? Our stories of joy and hope and courage. Our tales of everyday heroes battling nobly against all odds. How can we ever walk in our birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if we cannot even lay claim to our own stories?
That's why we're here. We are the offspring of a movement that never stopped. A movement to ensure all our stories are honored. That all of us might recognize the human ties that bind us. And we know that if we tell the full and truthful history of our people and place, then we can all learn to move again. The movement. It's not just an app. It's a space for us to tell stories that too often go untold. Stories that'll make you think. Stories that'll make you move. Stories that will inspire you to join us in the movement for human and civil rights. The best way to move is to be in the movement.
A lot of white supremacists used to like bomb Smithfield neighborhood because these were like more affluent black people, right, that lived in those type of neighborhoods. I think it would like to knock them down.
I'm breaking the mold. I shouldn't have a house that looks as good as yours, or even in the same neighborhood.
Right.
We have to understand these people were so wed to this that they outlawed children playing games with one another. Mm-hmm. But further than that, they made it illegal to build playgrounds for separate races of children within 2 blocks of each other. Mm. So not only could the kids not play with each other, they couldn't even see each other play. Mm-hmm. And it was this deep to them. And they were willing to defend that.
Yeah.
It should be easy to vote, but it seems like they're always making it hard, right? Mm-hmm. It always seems like they're always making it hard. But you have to understand that historically, this country they're kind of schizophrenic with their vote, right? Mm-hmm. So the first people that were able to vote were white men who owned property, mm-hmm. That basically said that you had to have some money in your pocket, right? Then, with the freeing of the slaves, then it was black men were able to vote, right? But you're still leaving out a whole other aspect, a whole other demographic of your population. Mm-hmm. Then finally, women are getting the right to vote.
The other thing that awareness does, in my opinion, when you think about, it hasn't been that long, unfortunately, between Trayvon and George Floyd. The difference is the exposure. The difference is the narrative and the way in which media was done during Trayvon's time, that you couldn't even try to act like you didn't know what was going on last year with George Floyd. It was too much awareness, right? So that awareness prompted a certain kind of response. In a lot of ways, it was so in your face that it made you have to come to terms with it. If nothing else, what do you feel about it, right? Maybe it didn't prompt you to actually get activated like myself and be out there getting sprayed and stuff by police, but or gassed by police. But I don't know one single person who didn't know the story of George Floyd, who didn't have to come to terms with what they felt about the conditions that created that opportunity or that moment with George Floyd. And so, but I know tons of people who couldn't, and to this day probably can't remember the whole story of Trayvon Martin, right? And they only remember the small pieces that they may have matriculated different places. And so I think the power of storytelling and the power of narrative and the power of social media really is that we can utilize it as a tool. We just have to have a strategy for it and a plan for it, because just like we can use it as a tool, the other side, or those who would seek to harm us, to take our our rights and our liberties away, they know how to use social media too, right? And a lot of times they're good at it. Their messaging, it's scary, it is, all kinds of things. So we have to make sure that our messages, that our the content that we put together, the way we tell the story about the power of voting, the way in which we tell the story about the power of our ancestors and the power of our current leaders and our future leaders, that is the kind of content that, even that you're making, today, that is going to help us propel, ourselves and our opportunities. In Alabama, we can do that. We've got a lot of rich content. We've got a lot of rich heritage. We just got to make sure that we're telling it in the right way that's compelling for people to align with the opportunities that are here for liberation and for justice. So I think you're doing that. You're a part of the solution. I'm so proud of you. And so let's just keep doing that work.
Hi, my name's Lorraine, and just like you, I'm a part of the movement, a movement that never stopped. I'm Black, queer, and non-binary, here to tell you the history of LGBTQIA involvement in the civil rights movement. But in order to understand that story, we have to go back. Preparations for a march on Washington, D.C. to celebrate the centennial signing of the Emancipation Proclamation were well underway. But in April, a new urgency for justice emerged. The nation at large witnessed atrocities committed by a fully militarized police department against school children who were nonviolently protesting segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. So, the centennial celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation had to be scrapped to make way for the great crescendo of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, a march meant to boldly proclaim the goals, hopes, and yes, even the dreams of the civil rights movement. If the movement was like an orchestra, there were 6 main sections, affectionately known as the Big Six. There was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, represented by Chairman Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, represented by Executive Secretary Roy Wilkins. The Congress for Racial Equality, represented by co-founder James Farmer. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, represented by John Lewis. A. Philip Randolph of A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And the National Urban League, represented by Whitney Young. Since each group had its own interests and demands, there was a need to consolidate and form a unified front to make some real music. They would eventually present their ideas to the President of the United States and the world at large through the 1963 March on Washington and get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. But what many don't know is that it took a skilled composer to orchestrate it all. Most don't even know who this man was. Bayard Rustin, who wrote the materials presented to the masses at the March on Washington, who served as an advisor to CORE during the Freedom Rides, who wrote the promotional materials and organized carpools for the NAACP during the Montgomery bus boycott, who was invited to the 1948 World Pacifist Conference in India to learn the nonviolent movement strategies and teachings of Gandhi, which he later passed to Martin Luther King, was asked to step away from the movement because of his sexuality.
I think that when we exclude the LGBTQIA community from movement building, not only are we missing out on the opportunity to tell some absolutely amazing stories, but we're setting aside some amazing leaders and amazing advocates. Even though Bayard Rustin had to hide portions of his own character in an effort to support the movement, he still led the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. He set aside part of who he was, and I think that if we didn't have to do that, we would be able to make it much further. Baird Rustin was so much more than just an impactful character in the civil rights movement. He was an impactful character in the LGBTQ movement for social and civil rights as well. He's the one who took us from a civil rights movement to a political one that's more recognizable today. All the way until the day he died, he was serving as a humanitarian and serving as a citizen of the world, not just of America. I think it would be to the detriment of Black liberation and to the liberation of all oppressed peoples to avoid celebrating the stories of everyone in their authentic selves.
And I lay down that hospital bed and I wrote the song. And it goes something like this. Go on, go on, go on. God is something he wants telling me to go on. Hey, go on, go on, go on. Well, it's something he wants telling me to go on. Go on, go on, go on. God is something he wants telling me.
When I close my eyes, I see the ripples of a movement. A movement that didn't start or end in Birmingham, but a movement that was defined by this place. I see Trayvon, Locke, Taylor, Floyd. Then my mind takes me back to this place, this hollow ground. A place where young people will grow with the knowledge that their grandparents were once children. Children who stood toe-to-toe with police officers wielding fire hoses, attack dogs, and bloody batons waiting to strike. A place where young leaders, college students, and children would transform the nation's understanding of liberation and bring us closer to a new kind of freedom, a kind of freedom that we never experienced before. My name is David DeGree, and just like you, I'm a part of the movement, a movement that never stopped. I'm a rapper, an artist, and a writer trying to better understand the story of youth activism. But in order to know that story, we have to go back to 1963, back before Birmingham became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement, before the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law, before Martin Luther King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech. We have to go back. Understand, before the civil rights movement accomplished its goal, in the South, Jim Crow was not just a mentality, it was a system that allowed white people to violently oppress Black children, women, and men, especially here in Birmingham. This system was carefully upheld by the Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Boyle Connor, and an army of white citizens, business owners, and domestic terrorists. The consequences of challenging Jim Crow meant incarceration, harassment, lynchings, and other forms of brutal violence. And even though Jim Crow enabled violence throughout the South, Birmingham was unique. Just imagine living in a city so dangerous that it earned the nickname Birmingham, a place where homes, churches, and businesses could be bombed without consequence or warning. Between 1946 and 65 alone, over 50 Black establishments were bombed. Something needed to change. The movement for civil rights and Black liberation was not a guaranteed success. In the early 60s, it was struggling. Campaigns across the South were not able to achieve what they set out to achieve. A Birmingham reverend and activist named Fred Shuttlesworth saw an opportunity to advance the movement and called on King to join forces and bring a bold new vision to life. Enter SCLC leaders James Bevel, Diane Nash, and Project Confrontation, an assembling of young adults to focus the nation's attention on the evils of Jim Crow by overwhelming Birmingham's jail system. But after months of sit-ins, boycotts, and peace walks, the organizers and young activists were still struggling. A new element was needed, an element of innocence, an element that can only be embodied by people like her.
I packed my purse and brought a change of underwear and toothbrush and all the things I thought I would need for an overnight stay, and I walked from my school, Ullman High School, down here to 16th Street Baptist Church. And when I got here, people were everywhere. The park was covered, the streets were covered. And I remember James Bevel and Andrew Young stood at the top of the steps at 16th Street Baptist Church. And they called out and said, if you're here to participate in the demonstrations, come into the church. And we went up into the church. We went into the sanctuary. And we started singing freedom songs. We sang, we rocked. Dr. King spoke to us, told us don't be afraid. Then we lined up. They lined us up in pairs. And we walked down those steps singing, We Shall Overcome. We were hand in hand. And I mean, that feeling, I can barely stand now to hear that song without it triggering something inside of me. It was on May 2nd, it was a Thursday. And we walked down those steps and we headed up the street. We were stopped by a uniformed police officer who told us we were in violation of a city ordinance. And he said, get out of this line and nothing's gonna happen. But you stay in this line, you're going to jail. Well, what he said didn't bother me. I knew I was going to jail. I left home to go to jail. But I was intimidated by what I saw. This was a white man. I had not encountered anything like that, being disrespectful to an adult, disobeying a white man who's a police officer. He's wearing a gun, he has a stick in his hand, and I'm prepared to disobey him. But somebody started singing loudly, We Are Not Afraid. That gave me the courage to stand fast and to be arrested and to go to jail. I'm Janice Wesley Kelsey. I was born, raised, and educated here in Birmingham. I've lived here my whole life, and if I were to say, who am I am a foot soldier. That, to me, is one of the most significant things that I have done, short of being a parent and grandparent. I think being a foot soldier served as a catalyst for change throughout the world. And so I'm proud to say I am a foot soldier from Birmingham, Alabama.
When I open my eyes, I feel the ripples of a movement that didn't start or end here in Birmingham, but a movement that lives in this place. I see the reflection of Miss Janice, Miss Ruby, Miss Annetta, Miss Jessie, elders who came here as children to transform our understanding of liberation and bring us all closer to a new kind of freedom, a kind of freedom we never experienced before. I see their reflections in me.